Morning. Peace be with you all. Thank you and welcome to the Alameda Museum lecture virtual speaker series. My name is Yoshii Shabazz and I'm a board member of the Alameda Museum as well as the chair of the events and exhibitions group. And so before I get started, we have our president who is on, and so I want to give you a moment if you want to just say a welcome.
All right, welcome everyone. It's been a while since we've had a lecture series. You know, we've all been at home, and thank you for joining us, and thank you to Rashid for getting this going. It's a whole new era for us using Zoom and doing this virtually. And thanks to our speakers who are presenting tonight.
Awesome, thank you, Valerie. And so I want to again welcome everyone, and I ask that folks who are not part of the speakers, if you could keep your video off and yourself muted until we come to the question and answer portion. And so Asian Americans have lived in Alameda for well over a century, but are often not reflected in the local histories, the dominant narratives, and the institutions that are seen as the authoritative sources of Alameda's history. In addition to efforts by individual families to share histories across generations, individuals and local organizations have preserved, maintained, and curated events and exhibitions to fill this void. As part of the effort to recognize local history that's too often marginalized, the Alameda Museum is hosting a Heritage Month themed virtual series. The month of May is Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have a long history in Alameda, dating back to the 19th century. And 2022 marks a series of Imperial and anti-Asian anniversaries. So following the rise of anti-Chinese sentiment in California, the United States Congress passed the Chineses Exclusion Act in 1882, barring Chinese immigration. Following the Filipino struggle for independence from Imperial Spain, the United States began its colonial occupation of the Philippines, with the formal war ending in 1902. And finally, after decades of anti-Japanese sentiment and exclusion, the United States President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, ordering Japanese American citizens to concentration camps. And Alameda was the first community evacuated. And so the story of the AAPI community in Alameda is not just tragic or tragedy. It's also a long story of resistance, of community, of coalition and institution building. From Alameda's Chinatown and Japantown to faith institutions and organizations like the United Filipinos in Alameda, the histories and contributions of Alameda, unfortunately, have been underappreciated. And so the Alameda Museum is honored to have three amazing folks who not only have researched and presented and preserved and curated local histories, but have created and continue to make history. And so the 2022 virtual series for the month of May focus on local and regional histories of three groups: Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino Americans. And so I'll briefly introduce our panelists, but first I want to begin with a brief land acknowledgement. And so the purpose is to acknowledge the land where the Alameda Museum is located. It's on the unceded territory of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people and what's now called Alameda. And I'd invite folks here on the call, if there's a place that you're tuning in from and you'd like to name it, please do. And if you're learning the names of the original people of the land that you're on, I'm gonna drop something in the chat so you can also learn the names of the people who have and continue to steward the land. And again, the purpose of a land acknowledgement, for those who are familiar with this, is not just to do something symbolic, but it's really to acknowledge the land and the people who are its original and current caretakers, and the intention of the practice of land acknowledgement is a step towards truth. And so if this land has not been ceded, and it's been a lot of harm that's been caused in the taking of that land, and all of us benefited from it. And so with that said, want to give thanks for our Indigenous relatives whose lands we are on. And now I have the honor of introducing the panelists, who are an amazing group of folks who I just honor, appreciate, and respect. And I really appreciate y'all for taking the time to be here and share. So starting first with Serena Chen. Serena Chen is a longtime Alameda resident who's a student of Asian American history and has taught Asian American studies at UC Berkeley and Laney College. She spent 15 years as a print and broadcast journalist, specializing in the coverage of Asian American social, cultural, and political issues in the Bay Area. As a community activist and social worker in the 1970s, she worked with community members to build the social service safety net that now continues to serve Asian immigrants, including health and mental health services, affordable housing, as well as the Asian Cultural Center. She currently serves as the vice chair of Alameda's Open Government Commission, and most recently served as a member of one of Alameda's police reform and racial equity subcommittees, looking at police policies and procedures. She is the immediate past president of the Asian Pacific American Democratic Caucus of Alameda County, which seeks to increase Asian Pacific American representation in local government. She is the proud mother of an Alameda High 2002 graduate. Reverend Michael Yoshii is a longtime faith leader and community activist in Alameda. Reverend Yoshii is a United Methodist clergy. And for over 3 decades, from 1988 to 2020, Reverend Yoshii led the Buena Vista United Methodist Church in Alameda. I'm slightly deviating from the bio you sent me, sir. Among the organizations he has helped found and co-found include the Coalition of Alamedans for Racial Equity, or CARE, the Alameda Multicultural Community Center, as well as Renewed Hope, or Housing Opportunities Provided Equally. He is currently the part-time coordinator of United Methodist students at the Pacific School of Religion and a member of the International Coalition of Human Rights in the Philippines Global Council, the ICHRP, GC, and the co-chair of the Friends of Wadi Fukin, a partnership with a Palestinian village in the Bethlehem district of the West Bank. And last but not least, we have Lillian Galedo, and I'm really grateful that you're here. Lillian is a daughter of immigrants from the Philippines. She was born and raised in Stockton, California, where her parents were farm workers. After attending the local community college, she transferred to UC Davis, where she received her bachelor's degree with support from the EOP, the Economic Opportunity Program. While a student, she was involved in the movement to end the Vietnam War and for the establishment of ethnic studies. During the 1970s and the early 80s, she was involved in the movement to end martial law in the Philippines and on such civil rights issues as the preservation of the International Hotel and affirmative action. In 1980, she began working at Filipino Advocates for Justice, formerly Filipinos for Affirmative Action, a community-based organization that serves the needs of the Filipino community, which is now over 130,000 strong in Alameda County. Lillian has sought to build an organization that provides essential services for recent immigrants and contributes to the larger movement for social justice. She helped found the National Network for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, the Dignity Campaign for Real Immigration Reform, and Alameda County United in Defense of Immigrant Rights. For over 25 years, Lillian was involved in the campaign to win equal status for Filipino World War II veterans. She also started FAJ's project to expand labor rights of caregivers and other domestic workers. FAJ is on the steering committee of the California Domestic Workers Coalition, which has won overtime pay for caregivers in California. Lillian also guided FAJ's tenant protections work, which helped win rent control in Alameda and a just cause policy in Union City. She's also the co-author of the text, Filipinos in the East Bay, and she retired from Filipino Advocates for Justice as executive director in 2018. So please welcome our esteemed panelists. So again, as a reminder, I ask folks to continue to keep yourselves muted and off screen while our speakers present. And we'll have some time shortly after 8 p.m. in which folks can ask questions. So without any further ado, I'd like to pass the mic to Serena Chen. Thank you.
Okay,
So thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. Also, Rashid, you're going to give me permission to share my screen, right?
You should have it now.
Oh, okay.
Go for it.
But I just wanted to preface by saying that when I first moved to Alameda in about 1996, one of the first places I visited was the Alameda Historical Museum. And I went in there and I looked all around to see where my predecessors or ancestors contributed anything to Alameda. And I found it in one little book, one very little book right here. Whoops.
Yeah, that's the Imelda Merlin's Alameda Geographical History.
And so I just thought, wow, we haven't really done much. So when Rashid asked me to participate in this today, I just thought, well, let me start digging. And so I'm going to share with you what I have found out and then put it in the context of national policy and statewide policies towards Chinese Americans. So let me see. Just so no one is confused, I named it appropriately. Who were, oh, is this too big for people?
It's excellent. Thank you, Serena.
Okay. So Asians were called celestials in Alameda. And the first recorded incidence of Chinese being in Alameda was in 1852, where they were depicted as the people hired by the wealthy as servants to cook, garden, and transport goods. The local papers had a very anti-Chinese bias, describing them as creating odors and unsanitary conditions, as well as committing petty theft. In 1854, the California Supreme Court reinforced racism against Asian immigrants in People versus Hall, ruling that people of Asian descent could not testify against a white person in court, virtually guaranteeing that whites could escape punishment for any kind of violence they committed on an Asian, as long as there was no naturalized American citizen as a witness. So Asians, if a group of Asians were attacked by a white person or any person, they really could not testify against a white person in court. But nonetheless, we persevered, and actually the Chinese were farmers. After they, in addition to were servants, they saved their money and they bought land and became farmers. And so this is Quang Fat's farm in 1897. And it's believed to have at that time been the largest farm in Alameda. It was located on Mound Street on top of a shell mound, and it grew corn, squash, pumpkins, and had a laundry. He was well known for being honest and truthful in all his dealings. His corn was legendary, and he provided food to a town which had no grocery stores and something we could call a food desert today. And I have to thank Gabriel Duncan for sharing this image with me, and he's been doing research on Native American history in Alameda. So what they did was they were the first, what do you call it, DoorDash? Basically, they grew the produce and they did, they brought it to the communities. As you can see, here's a peddler here and a housewife, I presume, looking to see what kind of vegetables and fruit she wanted. And by 1915, we had people being able to deliver. Like I said, they were DoorDash in 1915. But this was all under the umbrella or the dark clouds of the fact that the Ku Klux Klan chose Chinese Americans as their targets here in California. Because by 1970, Chinese immigrants were 10% of California's population and Blacks were only 1%. So if the Ku Klux Klan was going to gain traction in organizing people using hate, they'd have to choose Chinese immigrants. So there's a history that's only been published in the past 2 years about the forgotten history of the Western Klan. We were the targets of the Klan. So in 1967, a man named Henry Haight was riding on that wave of anti-Asian sentiment. And he built his entire campaign on anti-Chinese and anti-Black hysteria. And so he became governor. California was the only one of the only free state that refused to adopt the 14th and 15th Amendments, which were the two amendments that the Congress passed to as a result of ending slavery and to give rights to people. Unfortunately, he blocked that and stopped California from voting for the 14th and 15th Amendment until he was out of office. So he was out of office in just 4 years. But what he did was he bought a home in Alameda. And that's why I'm even mentioning him. So he came to Alameda using the same rhetoric he used when he ran for governor. And he maintained all of his beliefs and believed that African and Asian people were inferior to white people. I just have to say, as a side note, in 2019, 148 years later, Alameda's Haight Elementary School was renamed Love. But Rashid talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, but even before then, the Congress realized that in order to stop this horde of Asians, Chinese coming to the United States, they had to stop women from coming. So they passed a law called the Page Act. And the Page Act described literally all Chinese women as prostitutes unless proven different. So basically, and forbidden from entry to the United States. So basically, that whole myth that was spread about Chinese immigrants as being sojourners, as just being temporary travelers and sending their money back home, was actually regulated by US law. The men could not bring their women over, and they were also forbidden to marry white women. So basically, it just froze the Chinese population here with the men who came over early on. So one of the things that I discovered is that Alameda was turned into an island by Chinese workers. The Chinese who worked on the railroads and who worked on building the Chabot Dam actually were hired to dig up the marshland between the tidal channel between that linked Alameda Creek and San Leandro Creek. And so that turned Alameda into an island. So yeah, my own grandfather came over here as a young teenager, and he worked on the railroads. And this is from the California Railroad Museum in Sacramento, where they basically put gunpowder into rock crevices and blasted holes through the granite rock structures to build the railroad tracks through the mountains, dividing California and Nevada. And again, the we owe Chabot Lake to Chinese laborers who worked on building that as well. So this is just me doing the slideshow and doing a repeat. But basically, it was Chinese workers who divided the landmass that was a peninsula of Alameda from Oakland. But the antagonism, despite the necessity of Chinese workers, the antagonism against Chinese continued to grow. And this is a little editorial kind of comment in the Oakland Inquirer in 1906, which said, we just don't want to have any more Chinatowns in our cities. So in the 1930s, this sentiment continued with the redlining of communities to ensure that the prime areas, which are the blue areas, are only relegated for white people. And the red areas were the only places where people of color could successfully try to buy homes because they couldn't get loans. And if we were to look at the demographics of Alameda today, you see that the places where the people are segregated are also following along these lines from the 1930s. So it was only after the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 that Chinese Americans could bring their, restore their families because they were separated after 1945 from their family members in China. So they began to reunify slowly. So if you see this chart in 1990, Alameda was 90% white and 6% Asian. I'm sorry, I made these numbers wrong. I think this is 1970. Is that?
It's 1970.
It's 1970, I'm sorry. And then in 1990, it was 70% white and 19% Asian. And in 2020, and I just went through the census data just now. So these were numbers of white only. And I mean, these are whites, non-Hispanic whites, and these are any Asian. So what you see here on this chart is percent Asian of California in 1860. So in before 1873, it was close, it was about 9% Asian in California. And then with all the anti-Asian hysteria and everything, you could see the Asian population dropping in California to a low in 1950. And in 1965, this is 1965, where the Immigration Nationality Act was passed. And so very slowly people were getting their paperwork together to bring over their relatives and reunify families. So you can see that it was because of federal legislation that we were able to reunite our families. So today there are over 29,000 Asian and Pacific Americans in Alameda, comprising 37% of the total population. And this map, you can see this is Alameda and here's Bay Farm right here. The blue dots represent neighborhoods where they are predominantly Chinese. The yellow dots are the predominantly Filipino neighborhoods, and the orange dots are, there's one Vietnamese neighborhood right here. But here's a fact, 30.4% of Alamedans living below the poverty line are Asians. And you know, a lot of people keep believing the myth of the model minority, which we are not. And we have a huge stratification of well-to-do Asians and working class and people barely making it in the Asian American community. And so this is a chart showing the percentage of people living at the poverty line or below and their race here in Alameda. So in order to kind of justify marginalizing Asians and mistreating us and on all people of color, all these things have been used to define us. And as we are all aware of all the anti-Asian violent attacks that we've seen here all over the country and in California, there's a real increase in racial trauma. And these are the symptoms of racial trauma. Racial trauma is not a mental illness. It's a real thing. And it's a thing that happens when you're afraid to go out the door, you're afraid to go to Chinatown, your mother or your parents or yourself, you know, sometimes are very hesitant to go out in public. And it's because we see day after day these attacks on Asians. So a recent study done of about 10,000 people in the United States found this, that compared to 2021, Americans in 2022 are more likely to say that Asian Americans are at least partly responsible for COVID. So this is like here in the Bay Area, we're saying, wow, that's really crazy. But in the whole country, when they surveyed people, more people now believe we are responsible than before. And most people do not think that Asian American attacks are increasing, when in fact, in the past year, there were like 12,000 recorded incidents of anti-Asian harassment and attacks. So I guess if they don't see the news, it's not happening or it's not registering. This is another disturbing statistic that Asian Americans are among the least likely racial groups in the US to feel they completely belong. So it's a thing where you can't see it, but it's what people are reporting in polls and surveys, and it's something that we all feel. And the other thing that we've discovered is that Asian American and Pacific Islander women are, they're the ones reporting the most cases of harassment. And it's just been increasing over the past 12 months. And on a more lightweight note, I guess, one of the questions asked in this survey was, can you name a prominent Asian American? And 58% of the people said they don't know. And the biggest number, 7%, was Jackie Chan. Jackie Chan is not an Asian American. Jackie Chan is from Hong Kong. Bruce Lee, he was born in San Francisco. However, he died, 30 years ago? So 35, 40 years ago. So it's pretty crazy that right now, 58% of Americans cannot name a famous or well-known Asian American. So I thought, as a quiz for all of you today, and you can turn on your microphones, is can you name these Alamedans?
And you can also add these in the chat.
Okay, yeah, that would be great. Wait a minute, of course, now I don't know how to go back. All right, who is the first Chinese American woman to sit on the city council? Hello? Anybody? I see one answer. Is that any answer in the chat? Lena Tam, thank you, LD. Who is the first Chinese American to sit on the Board of Supervisors? Yes, it's Wilma, yay, okay. Who is the first Chinese American to sit on the Alameda School Board? Do I do theme music or anything here? No.
Dun, 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 dun.
Anybody?
We have LD again with Tam.
Yes, it's Neil Tam, right? So LD, you've got Tam down. Who's the first Chinese American to serve as our state treasurer? Chinese American Alamedan to serve as our state treasurer. Anybody? Okay, that's Betty Yee. Betty Yee is currently, Fiona Ma is our current state treasurer. Oh, thank you, Michael. I didn't know about Sam Lee. So the first Chinese American state treasurer was Betty Yee, and then she went on and ran for state controller. Is that right? Or am I confused? Well, somebody can, fact check me. Who was the second Chinese American to sit on the Board of Supervisors? Yes, Alice Lai Bitker. And here's a bonus point. Who was the first Chinese American to serve on the Open Government Commission? That's right, it's me. Ha ha ha. Lighten up, everybody. Okay, so this is just to say, some of us have a good high IQ about Asian Americans serving in public office who are Alamedans, but I feel as though we have this huge missing gap of history, because from the time of the 1965 and on, there's like very little information written about all the Chinese Americans who have contributed to the city of Alameda. So we will definitely, that's something it's on our to-do list and your to-do list. So I had prepared this talk originally for the vigil on anti-Asian hate. And we all remember how shocking it was to some of us that Black parents have to sit down with their children and talk to them about how to act when they're confronted with racism. And I realized that we all need to talk about racism, not just Black parents to their Black kids. It's like their Black kids are experiencing harassment and racism from somebody. So what we all need to do to learn more about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and all the amazing contributions we have made to Alameda and to California and to society as a whole, we need to open up our hearts and minds to all the information that is now available out there, and we need to talk about it. And we need to talk about it and also ask our friends what they mean when they tell an Asian joke, or what they mean when they say something offhand. Because if it goes unchallenged, then it means it's okay. And I just wanted to, some people had asked before about the whole history of the KKK in California, which covers the whole anti-Asian crusade. And then I just wanted to give a shout out to the Alameda Chinese Club, which was formed in 1972 by two people, Carol Chan and Dolly Fong, who basically looked around. They had moved to Alameda and didn't see any Chinese here. And you can see by the statistics, there were hardly any. So they formed a club, and now there are a lot more Chinese Americans, and they've been providing scholarships to Chinese American students for the past 40 years. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Serena, for sharing that history with us. So we're gonna come back, and folks will have opportunity to ask questions of all of our panelists, but we're gonna keep it moving and go next to Pastor Michael Yoshii. Welcome.
Thanks, Yoshii. Let's see if I can do my screen share. Thanks, Serena. That was a great presentation. Giving an overview from the Chinese American history, and then also up to date around anti-Asian violence. I've been asked to focus in on some of the Japanese American history in the community of Alameda, and see if I can move this over.
Yeah, under slideshow or maybe F5.
I'm trying to get to slideshow.
Yeah, it's a little bit to your right, right past animations. Yeah, a little bit more to the right and right here.
Am I there? Oh. My toolbar is blocking me.
Mm.
Can you see what I have up there?
Yes, sir.
Okay, is that okay?
Yeah, it's large enough. You could also try, I think it's F5 or Shift F5.
F5. Oh, here you go. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to just kind of start with a general understanding of Japanese immigration to this country. Japanese immigration is interesting because they designate the generations. The first generation is called Issei, and the second generation Nisei, and the third generation Sansei. I'm a Sansei. My grandparents came over to this country turn of the century, and it's after Ichi ni San 1, 2, 3. So Issei is the first generation, and they began migrating to Hawaii in the mid 1860s, and then gradually to the Pacific Coast and states of Washington, Oregon, and California. Between 1886 and 1911, there were about 400,000 Issei had come to the Western states, and Alameda was among their destinations. There's some photos of some early immigrants coming to Alameda. And then this photo shows a building that was erected in 1911. It's a brown shingle building that was erected for the church services for Buena Vista, what became Buena Vista Methodist Church. It was actually the Methodist Episcopal Church South that had planted outreach to new immigrants in 1898 over at a house over in Encinal Avenue, and then gradually moved to Buena Vista Avenue. And this kind of became a hub of activity socially as well as religiously. This was the Victorian that was on 2311 Buena Vista, has been since torn down, and a new sanctuary was built there. This is a photo of a Japanese school that was held at the church grounds. And this was a building that was used by the Buddhist temple of Alameda. The development of the Buddhist temple kind of parallels the Methodist establishment of their religious community. And they found this, I believe it was on Park Street, unused store. And there was a group called the Ashi Bukyokai, which was like a religious group out of the Buddhist denomination that hosted their worship services and activities as they began to get established. And this was also in the early 1900s. Some of you walk over on Santa Clara Avenue today, you might see the flower shop, the former flower shop that used to belong to the Tawada family. It was originally called Hayashi Florist, which opened in 1902 on Park Street and then moved to 2305 Santa Clara Avenue, the current location of another business that took over that building. And there were two families who ran the floral shops during subsequent periods of time. This is a man by the name of Ozeki, who was an immigrant from Japan in the early 1900s and settled in Alameda. He's kind of wearing a kind of a waiter's coat. And so he obviously was working in the restaurant industry. And this is a photo I want to give credits to the Japanese American History Project, which I'll talk a little bit more about a little later. But typically, immigrant like Ozeki was very involved in sort of entrepreneurship, kind of thinking about innovative ways for him to make a living. And he was doing that in the restaurant industry. Here's another photo from the Japanese American History Project from Harry Akeda's nursery on 2530 Blanding Avenue. And Harry and his family were also immigrants in the early 1900s and opened up this nursery. For Japanese Americans, nurseries and flower industries were very much kind of the opportunities for people to make a living and find economic opportunities for themselves. Here's a photo also in the early 1900s where Jack Fujikawa is advertising a cleaning and washing business. And here's a Mr. Fuji advertising his washing and ironing skills. In 1910, the captain says he was a resident of the Takuma Ito. The photo was residents of Takuma Ito, and it may have functioned also as a boarding house as well. I think this photo is attached to that particular one too, because people were looking for work. There were places in which there were things posted to help find people work. You can see here cooks, waiters, gardeners, all kinds of handy kind of work as well as cleaning houses. Here's a photo of a sewing school that opened up on Park Street. And so the second generation Nisei would be some of the folks young ladies who might come to the sewing school and learn how to sew. It was like of an entrepreneurship of an Issei woman who started the business there on Park Street. Japanese Americans kind of had their own social life in Alameda that was, very segregated in many respects. And there was a baseball team called the Alameda Taiku Kai that played in a segregated league in Northern California. ATK had a team primarily of people from Alameda, and they played from 1916 to 1938. Here's an old photo of one of their teams. They would travel to different cities in Northern California, and others would come to play with them in Alameda, kind of similar to like the old Negro leagues for baseball for the Black community. Here's a photo of a plaque that was dedicated in memory of the ATK baseball field, which is actually over on Walnut and Clement. And this plaque is still there. So it kind of gave honor to that athletic club and the function that it held for the community in terms of its social life. It's a photo of some of the community cultural celebrations. This is an Obon festival. It's a photo of a musical production that was done at the Methodist Church in 1937 called Old Kentucky Garden. And so if you can imagine, these are the second generation of folks who were born here in the United States and were acclimating to American culture and adopting kind of Western interests in many respects and kind of living life as they found their enjoyment and opportunities to express themselves. Here's a photo at the Buddhist temple with their congregation during this period. Now, of course, there are these numbers of challenges that the immigrants and their children faced as they came into Alameda and also in the larger region of California. One of them was the alien land law, which was passed in California in 1913, targeting Japanese immigrants by prohibiting non-citizens from owning land and entering into long-term leases. So you can imagine that many of these folks who are trying to open businesses or to even for people who are trying to buy properties, that they had challenges in trying to make a go at things. And so they would often have to put the properties in the names of their children or have a friend in the Caucasian community who would buy the land for them. I think there's a story that the Buddhist temple was able to acquire land for their temple through a Caucasian person in the community. And of course, as time went on, there was the Anti-Asian Exclusion Act in 1924, which barred, this is really targeting Japanese community, especially barring further immigration from Japan, but several other Asian communities as well. This kind of poster shows kind of some of the anti-Japanese sentiment that was leading up to these kinds of legislations for the alien land law and also the Anti-Asian Exclusion Act in 1924. This was a poster taken from a meeting that was organized in San Francisco where people were organizing their Japanese and Korean Exclusion League. And basically they were targeting both Japanese and Korean communities and forming actually organized groups to begin to articulate their concerns about the invasion from Asian countries. And this also falls on the heel of what Serena has already talked about in terms of the anti-Chinese, specific anti-Chinese sentiments and targeted efforts against the Chinese community as well. Here's another photo of this is really kind of a campaign literature for Eugene Schmitz, who was a labor champion and was running for mayor in San Francisco. There's also quite a bit of media coverage around this that, we know that that's what takes place, is that there becomes the media education or the media propaganda that leads into the passage of legislation. And that legislation was passed in May of 1924, banning Japanese immigration. This is a full coverage of what that bill did. As you can see, it included barring immigrants from Japan, China, Philippines, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, Singapore, Korea, Indonesia, Burma, India, Sri Lanka, and Malaysia. And of course, one of the biggest problems with the Immigration Act 1924 was that many people then went back to their own countries. Those who were here from Japan or from China left to go back to their countries rather than stay here. It's interesting, a couple of years later, specifically in Alameda, there was a Japanese language school that was on the agenda of the Alameda City Council in 1926, and there was the Ku Klux Klan showing up in person to oppose the establishment of the Japanese language school. Actually, I give credit to Yoshii for giving me this copy of the original minutes, hand-typed minutes, which shows here the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan protests property on the south side of Buena Vista Avenue for Japanese language school purposes. So you can see that in that period of time, the Japanese living here had to make decisions about whether to go back, to stay here. Some were beginning to establish families and having children, and as they were having their children, kind of looking at the needs to grow the community here in Alameda. This map, I think, is the same one that Serena showed around the redlining of the community, and the red area here is the areas in which both Japanese, I think some Chinese, and particularly blacks down in this area were kind of moved into these particular neighborhoods because that was the places that would be open to them, whereas the greenish yellowish was not. One of the interesting things I think we can find too is that the blue area here, which would be kind of the Fernside district, and blue over here, which would be, I believe, the Gold Coast, were areas where there were housing covenants. So people of color couldn't live there at all. Something that I learned about as we talked with many of the Japanese elders in our community about where they could and could not live. What this meant was that they had to form community around the neighborhood where people were able to find homes. Here's a map that was put together by the Japanese American History Project that's going on now, and it shows kind of a 5-block radius. You can see here Oak Street and Park, Walnut Street, and then Central down to Blanding. And this is where most of the Japanese lived, in these neighborhoods. They were able to find their homes there. And also what they began to do was start their businesses. So some of the photos I showed you earlier, for example, the flower shop, where is that? Right here. The flower shop is over here, Tawada Flowers. The sewing shop would be over on Park Street, along this strip here. A lot of Japanese businesses. And you think about the businesses were serving their own community, so it's sort of like within their own Japantown or Nihonmachi, so to speak. At the same time, they are businesses that people were putting together to try to make a living. They're also connected to other Japanese communities in the East Bay as well. I'll show you just another map in a moment, but I wanted to also locate here the Buddhist Church of Alameda here. And then the Buena Vista Church is over here. Losing myself. Oh, right,
Yeah, it's where that little cross is.
right
Yeah.
there. Okay.
You got about 2 more minutes, Pastor Yoshii.
Okay, let me move on real quickly then. So this is a map of Oakland and Alameda. I just wanted to show this because there was a large Japanese community there as well. And Japanese Americans kind of were connected regionally together. And so often people would help support each other within their own community. I'm gonna pass on this one. As we went into the late 30s and the outbreak of war, most people know about the infamous mass incarceration of Japanese Americans in 1942 in Alameda. What this meant was Japanese Americans were taken first to the Tanforan racetrack in San Bruno, and then after that taken over to Topaz, Utah, for the most part, in one of the 10 camps set up in the interior of the United States. people came back. This is a photo of the Buena Vista Church back in celebrating their 50th anniversary after the wartime. I wanted to just spend a moment on redress and reparations, and I'll close out. Redress and reparations were the movement for Japanese American community toward the late 70s and early 80s. They were able to get a bill passed in which there was a commission set up to hear testimony from Japanese Americans across the country. This was one of those hearings held in LA. There were hearings held wherever Japanese American populations were prominent. And so the one closest to Alameda would have been in San Francisco. There were 3 days of hearings in the summer of 1981. And there were also lobbying visits to Washington, D.C. after the hearings were held in 81. And it resulted in the passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, in which it was identified from the commission hearing of the testimonies that the three things that led to the incarceration of Japanese Americans was the wartime hysteria that existed, the lack of political leadership, and pre-existing racism. This was the signing of the bill. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Pastor Yoshii, and sorry that the time feels so constricted. I think
No problem.
any of you deserve more time, but thank you. So I want to pass the mic now to our last speaker, Lillian Galedo. Thank you.
Hello. I'm trying to share my screen here.
Yeah,
Oh,
you
I
got it. The share screen at the bottom, little green
I
button,
clicked that.
and then you find that window. I know you probably got a couple windows open. You got it.
Do I? Do I? Okay. So how do I get just this?
Yeah, at the top right, on the top, there's a slideshow menu. At the top, be at the top menu bar. So you know there's the apple in the top right hand corner.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you can use that one and then just the play from current slide. So to the left, yeah.
Put that.
Oh, you might have to click the slideshow button again. It just changed.
Oh no.
You got it.
No.
And then back to the left, and then that from current slide or from the start. Awesome. Thank you, Lillian.
Oh, thank God. Thank you, Rashid. Oops. Uh-oh. Okay. So, thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry that my presentation was kind of last minute, pulling it together. But I wanted to mention first that there are probably more than 4 million Filipinos in the United States now. About 1.5 or 6 million are here in California. And as Rashid mentioned earlier, 130,000 in Alameda County, and probably about 6,000 in the city of Alameda, making up about 7.5% of the population. So you might wonder why there are so many Filipinos in the United States and in Alameda County and the city of Alameda. And it has everything to do with what Rashid mentioned earlier of the colonial relationship of the U.S. that the U.S. has with the Philippines, and the persistent underdevelopment of the Philippines because of centuries, basically, of colonization by first Spain and then the United States. So on June 12th of 1898, the Philippines had actually won its independence from Spain with some help from the U.S., who had offered to help them. But 6 months later, found out that the U.S. had negotiated with Spain to cede the Philippines to the United States for $20 million in the Treaty of Paris. So the Philippines then faced another colonizer, the United States, who we thought was going to be our friend. So the Filipino people resisted again, and as was mentioned, conducted a 10-year guerrilla war to prevent the occupation of the Philippines by the United States. But of course, the U.S. had much more firepower than the Filipino people, and eventually the war was lost. There were 24,000 Filipino combatants killed, 500,000 civilians, and 4,200 American soldiers. And even while the Philippine War was going on, the US began a miseducation campaign fairly soon that promoted the belief that everything they use in English by teaching American history and the principles that the United States was a place of equal opportunity, firing the imagination of many Filipinos to migrate to the United States. The US began an education campaign to bring Filipinos to the United States to attend US colleges in the attempt to basically create a elite class that would be able to be their proxies in terms of the colonial government. Some of these students in the picture here are students at UC Berkeley. And many of the students who came on these education campaigns never finished and were forced, if they wanted to stay in the United States, to work in agriculture and domestic services. The US had also set up a number of bases in the Philippines and recruited their colonial subjects into the US Navy in particular, as well as other maritime services, to serve as stewards and cooks and to play in the military band. And many of them were offered US citizenship and therefore migrated to the United States. Between 1920 and 1930, the Filipino population grew from 5,600 to 45,200. The majority were young males, single males between the ages of 16 and 21. And in the East Bay, Filipinos tended to settle near places of agriculture like Bay Farm or Alvarado and Centerville and Irvington, which became Union City and Fremont area, as well as Mission San Jose, or near military installations like the Navy Air Station in Alameda, the Army base in Oakland, and Mare Island in the Vallejo-Vacaville area. That we settled in communities like Alameda and in West Oakland, the San Antonio neighborhood, which is right across the island of Alameda, and Oakland Chinatown. A few Filipinos immigrated as wives of Buffalo soldiers, and Buffalo soldiers were African Americans who were among the occupying force, who married local women and brought them back to the United States. This is a picture of the daughter of an African American soldier in Filipina who lived in Alameda and was very active in the community. Many states, including California, had anti-miscegenation laws that forbade interracial marriage. And in this photo, Mary Dickinson met Augustine Lopez, who is a Filipino United Methodist minister in Oakland, and traveled, and they had to travel to Seattle in order to get married because Washington state did not have miscegenation laws, anti-miscegenation laws, and returned back to Oakland so that he can continue his ministry. In 1933, a Filipino, Salvador Roldan, won a case that challenged anti-miscegenation laws in California. because the court agreed with him that he was a Malay, not a Mongolian, which was the stated race that could not marry white women. But and therefore the court ruled in his favor. But then the California legislature simply passed another law that include Malays among the groups of people who were barred from marrying white women. With the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Filipinos who were already in the U.S. volunteered to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces through the segregated 1st and 2nd Filipino infantries. Veterans of the 1st and 2nd Infantry were granted citizenship in 1943, while Filipinos who were recruited in the Philippines to serve under the U.S. military were, after the war was over, denied citizenship. Following the end of the war in 1945 was the 1945 War Brides Act, which began the non-quota flow of immigrant wives and children to the U.S., many of whom settled in Alameda, Oakland. This was a baby boom, of which I am also a product. And this is a photo of children on Bay Farm Island who are welcoming the arrival of a new Filipino family into Alameda, and following World War II. Children also were integrated into all the Americanized activities in the area. And these children, though, are actually being taking oath to be members of the Sons of the American Legion. And these are students, Filipino students, who gathered at UC Berkeley before a football game in the early 1950s. And as was mentioned before, the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act changed the demographics of the United States by ending the preference for European immigrants and establishing equal numbers of immigrants from every country. It's interesting that during the signing of the bill, Lyndon Johnson made the point of saying to some of the critics that this would not have any impact on the diversity of the United States, which he obviously was wrong about. Since 1965, Filipino immigration to the U.S. has increased by an average of 100% every decade, making Filipinos among the highest immigrating groups to the U.S. By 1980, the Filipino population had become evenly balanced between men and women and employed in every sector of the economy, including tech, finance, education, engineering, and of course the medical and health industries. This new generation of immigrants brought professionally trained immigrants from the Philippines. And in the next generation, many of the children of the first generation were beginning to be in other trades. Like this is a construction worker, Ben Luis, who is part of Reverend Yoshii's congregation, and Helen Toribio, who was a resident of Alameda and taught in the community colleges. For the past 50 years, Filipinos have extended our leadership and civic duty beyond the Filipino community. Beginning in the late 1960s, Filipino students joined a growing identity and self-determination movement that intersected with the anti-war movement and the movement for ethnic studies and affirmative action on college campuses. Filipino students helped lead the strikes at San Francisco State and at UC Berkeley, and for the establishment of classes and departments teaching an accurate history of our people's contributions. The Tagalog banner in this translates to "do not be meek." Here in the Oakland, Alameda area, There was the development of many social services and nonprofits who did organizing around housing and immigrant assistance, cultural expression, as well as worker and community organizing. This is a project that was in Oakland that was attempting, like the I Hotel, to save a hotel in downtown Oakland for the Filipino elderly who were living there. This is a youth group that was formed of young people from Alameda and Oakland called Filipino Youth Development Coalition. No, I forget what the C stands for. And this is an organization in Alameda called Filipino American Community Services, which all of which were attempting to provide support to the huge influx of immigrants that were coming post 1965. Here in the United States, there was a active movement in opposition to martial law in the Philippines. It was a national campaign, which was unlike any other organizing campaign of Filipinos in the United States, that endured for 15 years until the dictator was finally run out of the country in 1986. And it started with this blacklist that the Marcos government issued, and on it is at least one Alameda resident that I can identify, Sylvia Saviano, who actually still lives in Alameda today. In the early 1990s, the Filipino community began a campaign to redress the Rescission Act, which had denied citizenship to Filipinos who were living in the Philippines who joined the US military. Sad to say that we were not successful in reversing that betrayal, have only one small concessions, like their ability to be married in military cemeteries, but they were never allowed to have to be fully recognized as US veterans. And this was a campaign that brought support from a lot of young people. In this photo, they are mainly high school and college students. Following the terrorist attacks on September 11th, airport security was blamed for a lapse that allowed the terrorists to get on the planes. Here in the Bay Area, 3 airports where over 60% of airport screeners were immigrant, particularly Filipino immigrants. Thousands of screeners were fired from their jobs, many of whom lived in Alameda because the airport screeners, who tended to be pretty much on call, had to live close to the Oakland airport in order to keep their jobs. Community activists supported the screeners in their effort to keep their jobs, but were not able to overcome the level of scapegoating that was rampant following 9/11. And only a small number had been able to get reemployed in their jobs. The organization where I worked before, Filipino Advocates for Justice, helped lead a California campaign to improve the working conditions of domestic workers, caregivers in particular. And I think almost everybody knows that that Filipino immigrant, particularly immigrant women, are caregivers in great numbers, many of whom work in the care facilities in Alameda, and sometimes being able to live in Alameda by living in small groups where they share an apartment. Sometimes a worker will have the night shift and the other tenant will have the day shift, and they would basically share a bedroom by trading off, who slept in the bedroom in order to be able to live near where they worked in the care facilities in Alameda. And of course, everybody in Alameda knows about the rent control issue. Since more than half of US population continues to be renters, we became active by supporting a group of Filipinos who were basically threatened with eviction on Central Street. And it was a kind of a 5-year campaign that brought us into the campaign for rent control in Alameda. But sadly, the tenants at the, I think it was 470 Central.
470 Central.
Right, were pretty much driven out of their homes by a person who bought the apartment building and raised the rents on all the units. So we worked on this campaign along with Alameda Renters what is it?
Coalition.
Coalition. Thank you, Rashid.
I got you. In just about 2 more minutes.
Yes, I'm almost done. And in the process, we followed in the footsteps of, well, we won rent control in Alameda, and followed in the footsteps of Filipinos who were beginning to run for office and become elected officials in the city of Alameda. This is Tony Daisog, who is the first Filipino to be elected to the Alameda City Council. Malia Vea followed him some years later. And of course, Rob Bonta, who was part of the rent control campaign, was elected to be the first Filipino on the State Assembly of California, and is now our Attorney General. So that's where I end.
Wow, thank you so much, Salamat po. Appreciate it, Lillian. And with the time that we have left, I wanted to first give you all space for our panelists, if you all have any questions that you would want to ask each other. And so I'd like to give you that moment, if there's anything that came up while you all were sharing.
Well, I was wondering if Reverend Yoshii was part of that research project of the Japanese community in Alameda. I wasn't aware about it.
You mean the current project?
The one upon which your presentation is based.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Before I retired, we put a proposal together to do an Alameda Japanese American History project. So there's some federal funding and partnering with a group called Densho, which is Japanese American Digital Archives, Japanese American History, and the Internet Archives as well. And so what's happening, you know, that map that I showed with where all those businesses were and residents of Japanese Americans, that was the community that was basically erased with the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans. And so what we're trying to do is to restore the history, and then there'll be markers at the two religious anchor institutions, the Buddhist temple and the Methodist church. There'll be a marker at the Alameda Library and a marker at the Alameda Marketplace, the store over on Park and Buena Vista. And they'll each have their own displays of the history, and they'll serve as a departure point for a walking tour through the old neighborhood. So that's kind of the goal of that. And what I understand, the committee's been meeting, you know, last several years, couple of years, and I think they're gonna. I've been told that they'll have the markers ready probably by this fall, and to have a public launching of that.
Somehow in my presentation, I dropped out this map that Ellie Luis did of Oakland Chinatown, where Filipino businesses, who for some period of time considered Chinatown Filipino town, and those businesses were thriving during the 1950s and into the early 60s. I think the last one was a barbershop that finally closed, the Hollywood barbershop that finally closed in I think the mid 1980s. But there was quite a thriving Filipino business community right alongside Chinatown in Oakland.
Awesome. Thank you, Lily. And did anyone else have a question for each other or a response?
I just wanted to ask Reverend Yoshii. Um, there were 900 Japanese Americans in the 1940 census. Do you know approximately how many actually returned after they were incarcerated for 4 years?
I don't know the exact numbers that returned, but I would say anecdotally, probably about half to 2/3 that returned, and others that kind of scattered from where they moved to. And I think both the Buddhist temple in Buena Vista, the doors were closed for their worship services, but they served as storage facilities for people's belongings that they couldn't take with them or that were not disposed of or taken by other people kind of during their fire sales. And then when they did come back, the both spaces were used as hostels for people to come back and live for people that couldn't find places to live.
Yeah, I was just looking at the census.
Mm-hmm.
And the last census has 918 Japanese.
In 1940?
No, this in 2020.
Oh, 2020. Wow.
Yeah. So basically, y'all were eviscerated. I mean, basically, people did not return back to Alameda.
Yeah, in many respects, I think that's true.
And then
Although there were baby, Lillian talked about being a baby boomer. I would be a baby boomer too, and my generation would be baby boomers. So those that came back, there were a few born in the camps, but then a lot were born after the camps from late 40s, early 50s. But people would tend to move out of the area and not return.
so it's I had no idea until I started studying what was happening with Japanese Americans in Alameda, just how vibrant and robust a community existed here. And it just literally overnight, right? They were put on buses and taken away.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really tragic. But I was just looking at how the three of us come from really distinct international histories.
Mm-hmm.
Like everything that happens in the country of our ancestors affects what happens to us today.
Right.
And I feel like we have somebody hit a reset button, because if we had given this same presentation 3 years ago, everyone would have said, oh my goodness, these shocking things happened. But hearing myself talk and hearing both of you talk, everything is happening all over again.
Absolutely.
And it's not shocking, which makes it really depressing. It's like the really good thing is our youth are really strong and vibrant, and we're all communicating with each other. But we really need to pull together, all of us, the entire community, to really withstand the kind of things that are happening now.
Mm-hmm.
Right, Lillian?
One reason why it might seem so polarized is because people of color are basically asserting their right to know their history, their right to be included in the curriculum in the schools, and then it just brings out, the white supremacists who have become more organized in order to counter what is basically, I think a foregone conclusion. We're all going to have to accept diversity. We're all going to have to share power. We're all going to have to share space. And, while there's resistance to that, I think it's moving in that direction.
Thank you all. I would be grateful if I was ever able to be in a room with y'all and just sit back and listen to y'all. And so interjecting feels slightly strange, but I want to invite the community folks who are on this Zoom to add any questions that you may have into the chat. And in our last few minutes, I hope we have an opportunity to address some of those questions. So you all have talked about the sort of distinct histories, these transnational histories, and some of the connections that were on the screen, for instance, redlining or the common experiences with exclusion. And I'm curious around some of the similarities that you all noticed through the presentations, and then some of the distinct histories that probably should be, you may want to lift up, because oftentimes it's sort of this essentializing Asian American narrative or AAPI that doesn't speak to some of the distinct histories.
I think one comment I would make, Rashid, is that, you know, the whole notion of API is a political identity for APIs to gather together. And, you know, Native Hawaiians are under that banner in some spaces. In some spaces, they prefer to have their own, you know, space to have their own voice. But part of that is because when it comes to the collective API experience in dealing with racism in this country, people who are racist don't distinguish between our ethnicities. We experience the same things, whether somebody is South Asian and is Sikh, you know, or wearing some kinds of cultural garb that identify them as being different, or whether they're Chinese or Japanese. And, you know, how many times have I experienced in my lifetime somebody yelling at me, "Go back to China, you chink," you know, then they don't know that I'm Japanese, right? But that's where I think racism covers all of us in the same way. And I think why API communities have been galvanized in the last couple of years around this resurgence of anti-Asian hate, because we're all experiencing that together in one umbrella. But at the same time, we come from very distinct stories in terms of migration to this country and distinct histories. And then there are relations between the different countries in Asia itself and the different political factors that complicate things in terms of people's intra-community relationships sometimes, you know. And I think we in the Asian Pacific Islander communities, we know that there are distinct histories, but we've also moved through periods of time where that solidarity has been stronger than at other times, you know. And I think back, you know, Lillian and Serena, we all go way back. I mean, we're kind of the older generation now for young people, but we all go back to the Third World Strike era and the formation of, you know, this kind of Asian American movement identity where people were banding together as Asians. And kind of during my lifetime, I've seen immigrants coming to this country where people are actually more focused on national identities rather than an API identity per se. So I think this is just part of the landscape of things, but then that's why it's important always to remember that there are distinct contexts and histories for people as well.
One thing I didn't get much time to go into was Filipino participation in labor organizing, especially among agriculture workers. You know, going all the way back to the 30s, Filipinos were organizing unions a lot of times on their own, just as Filipino unions, but also at times in solidarity with other workers in the fields, particularly Mexican workers, white workers. And so, you know, very few people realize that the Great Strike that became the United Farm Worker Union was started by Filipinos, but that was just one of many strikes in agriculture that Filipinos led and participated in, and it was a very, very, very dangerous time to do that. And some of my peers who come out of the Third World Strike and the anti-war movement and, you know, all of that organizing that we did as young people, they're now part of the labor movement. You know, they're in leadership and active union members. And many kind of service sector or in some construction related unions. And so that's something that is kind of carrying through the different generations.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Serena, is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, back in the old days, I used to interview everyone from all the different Asian ethnic groups. And I kind of formed like patterns. Like I always, the Filipinos, Americans who came on my show, we had a Christmas choir singing about the Marcos regime. But so the organizers were very performance based and much more performance arts based. I mean, I wouldn't see very many Chinese American groups who were like singing and doing things like that. So it starts to make sense to me listening to Lillian talk about how Filipinos were also relegated that kind of role by the occupying force, the colonial forces. The other thing I noticed is that I would have people on my show who were the Filipino version of so-and-so, and so-and-so, like the Filipino Elvis Presley, or the Filipino this is Filipino that. And, I'm sitting there scratching my head going, okay, I'll go with that, right? But I realized the more you kind of uncover an onion and think about how cultures form, I always loved that the Filipinos combined Filipino native culture with Catholicism. So, like at Easter, these people would crucify themselves. They would do these things that I just thought was
extreme, yeah.
was wild. But it's just like we're not all the same, but we all experience a lot of similar experiences. And the trauma that we have felt through the generations is the same. And so I just feel like we are connected in that way. And in traumatic times, we really have to hang on to each other.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Since we're at 8:30 or a little past, I just have one last question I'd like to ask you all, and use this as a segue to closing. Serena, you mentioned when you first moved to Alameda, you visited the museum and didn't see yourself reflected there. And so I'm curious from all of you, how could the Alameda Museum help to or better represent some of the different Asian American Pacific Islander experiences?
Well, I guess kind of in the vacuum, about understanding our own history. There is a National Filipino American Historical Society, and I think that the museum may want to connect with the chapter of the Historical Society to begin listening to what we have learned about our history through our self examination, doing our own research, getting people to tell their stories, that's and make that connection, because it could help sort of broadcast what we have learned in our kind of self examination over the past, I think it's now been about 20 years that the Historical Society has been in progress. And I know that you might have seen through the Arcadia books, there's all these Filipinos of Stockton, of San Francisco, Vallejo, basically people gathering photographs and stories and putting them together with our collective narrative.
And just a note, Lillian is co-author of Filipinos of the East Bay. How about yourself, Reverend Yoshii?
I would piggyback on what Lillian said. For Japanese Americans, there is something called NINJAS, National Japanese American Historical Society, in Japantown, San Francisco. So it's a really great resource for general history of Japanese Americans. And then digitally, Densho, I think it's densho.org, I'm not totally sure, but they have become sort of the digital housing of Japanese American history as well. They've got great, resources on Japanese American history in general, and have a lot of oral histories on their sites as well. I think particular and peculiar to Alameda, I think what the museum can do is, for Japanese American community, a lot of the folks are gone, that second generation who went through the wartime incarceration, most of those folks have passed on. That's why the project that people are working on now with the Alameda Japanese American History Project is really important. And I'm confident that the museum will be able to facilitate accessing the resources of that project for the archives of the museum, especially with a board member like you on the museum.
So ditto, the Chinese American Historical Society has reached out, and because in the course of them doing all of this San Francisco based Chinese history, they have uncovered a lot of the history of East Bay Chinese as well. And so I think that if the Alameda Museum could reach out, or we could facilitate them reaching out to the national respective museums, we could like turn Alameda's museum from a black and white coloring book to a full rainbow of who all lives here, especially now. Just looking at the data, 37% of Alamedans are of Asian or Pacific heritage. And it doesn't feel like it when you walk around town. So I think that the museum needs to capture our history, our collective history, and through this process, I realized how, the Chinese laborers did all the heavy lifting to make Alameda an island. And most likely built the railroad tracks that once ran through Alameda. So, Japanese had a huge, vibrant community, and the Filipinos were and still are a very important core of how Alameda has evolved. So, and then I starting to look at the other Asian ethnic groups that now live here on the island. And it's like we're missing all these chunks of history, the three of us are kind of aging out. So we're saying, wait, let's collect what we need, what we can, and what we can still remember from our long-term memory. But we see the newcomers coming, and we need to capture their stories too. So it would be really exciting place to see everybody getting excited about rediscovering their histories and discovering them for the first time. Yesterday, we were honoring Nielsen Tam at the Alameda Unified School District Administration Building. And one of the speakers was one of the student school board members who's going to Harvard. And he's a senior at Encinal High School. And basically he said just 2 days ago, he was cussed out and told to go back to his country because the car he was in was slow in pulling away from picking somebody up. So this is still happening. It's still happening here in Alameda. And why does this keep happening? And the solution is in all of us, in everyone, and every institution and every group in this city needs to look inside to say, how can we become more inclusive and involving?
One last piece I want to add, Rashid, if you have a minute. So building on, Serena mentioned the event yesterday. There was also an Afghan student who came and spoke, and she's graduating, going to Davis, but she was talking about her family story and them coming from Afghanistan, and how what's going on there is sort of erased from our media right now. So, with so much attention on Ukraine, of course, there was like this media coverage of what happened in Afghanistan with our pullout, but then people are just really struggling, right? The refugees that have left Afghanistan. And so there are young people and families coming over into Alameda now, holding on to what I call living history. Their stories are things that are going on now. In Alameda, there's a huge Yemeni community, and the devastation going on there with the war in Yemen is something that most people don't know about here. But we don't want to wait 20 years from now to hear about what they've been going through. And I think that's where the different influx of people migrating to the country and finding home in Alameda, there's an opportunity for people to help lift up those stories and also really understand what's going on, in these places, and also how it affects people here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Reverend Yoshii. Thank you, Lillian. Thank you, Serena, for making those connections between the different histories and the living history right now. Sometimes history is just refined or defined as just, some old material thing, and knowing that it's the different experiences you all being. I don't hope y'all don't think when I say y'all live in history that's like, it's a bad thing. Me too, because I got little grades now too, Pastor. But I really appreciate you all for taking the time to be present, to prepare images and words and these narratives that capture just a little bit of the different histories, and just also that call to develop a much more inclusive history. I want to just thank everyone for being present, and those who are also watching this video at whatever point in time you do. And for those who are present, I just want to encourage you to learn more about the Alameda Museum at the website, the Alameda Museum, alamedamuseum.org. I encourage you to become a member. There's currently in the Alameda Museum Quarterly excerpts from a memoir of a longtime Japanese American resident. And so there'll be many more opportunities to learn more about these local histories. Our next virtual event with this speaker series will take place on Monday, June 20th, and it will be a Juneteenth focused event, which will also commemorate the 1966 tent in at Franklin Park by the residents of the estuary housing. And so again, you can go to the Alameda Museum.org website, and I encourage you to follow the Alameda Museum on social media. So again, thank you all for your participation and being here, and take care. Peace.
Thank you.